Before I begin, I'd like to make one comment. I've worked long and hard to come to certain conclusions in my life. And some of you may completely agree with my perspective, some of you may partially agree, or not at all. But it's perfectly fine, because today I'm going to share with you my steps in my journey of forgiveness and what works for me. I wrote a memoir called Descendants of Rajgrod, Learning to Forgive. One other thing, there's somebody here also in the audience. I just met a wonderful woman named Shirley, who is also a descendant of Rajgrod. I thought that was really interesting today. Rajgrod is a town located in northeastern Poland. Rajgrod means the city of paradise. Well, September 1st, 1939, World War II started. Poland, as you know, was caught between Hitler, the Nazis on its west front, and Stalin and the Soviets on its eastern border. As the Nazis invaded Poland, the war started, and the Soviets first took over the city of Rajgrod. They came in, they desecrated the town church, they killed the Catholic priest, they killed many of the non-Jewish Poles and sent the men to Siberia to work camps. Eventually, as the Nazis invaded further into Poland, the Soviets retreated from Rajgrod and the Nazis took over the town. Now, my father was 21 years old when the invasion of Rajgrod happened. The Nazis had asked a group of Poles and some other soldiers to gather 100 Jews into the town square. So my father's Holocaust began with a home invasion. Here is a picture of my father's house, my grandma's house in Rajgrod. Men burst into his house, grabbed his mother, Bela, and his two sisters, and dragged them outside. They started to strip them down to their underwear. My father was hiding in a shack or a barn nearby. He heard his mother plead, "Please kill me quickly, have mercy on me." And they took their time. So my father witnessed the death of his mother and two sisters, hacked. He witnessed this unimaginable horror, and he ran into the forests of Rajgrod, and he never looked back, and he never went home. As to the fate of the other Jews in Rajgrod, they gathered 100 Jews, 4 by 4, into the town square, lined up, naked. They marched down the main street of Rajgrod, singing, forced to sing, throwing their clothes to the Poles, and along with the Nazis, they were marching through the town another 2 kilometers into the forests of Rajgrod, where 2 SS officers were waiting, and they executed the Jews in waves. And they buried them in a massive grave. There's another 500-600 Jews of Rajgrod left. They were forced into a ghetto. Then several Jews from the nearing towns, small shtetls, came to Rajgrod into the shtetl. Some Jews were the Nazis forced some of the Jews to go to the Jewish cemetery to desecrate it, to take the tombstones, break them down, because they were being used to pave roads for the Nazis. Eventually, all the Jews of Rajgrod were transported to Treblinka, a death camp, where the majority of my family, they were all gassed to death. So my father, shocked, horrified, ran into the forest and spent 3.5 years living like a mountain man. He drank the muddy waters. He ate berries or any type of vegetation, ate roadkill, ate the bark off the trees, killed when he needed to survive. He eventually made his way to Germany, near Hamburg, in a DP camp called Bergen-Belsen, where my father, with another 12,000 Jews, remained in this camp for several years until 1950, when my father took the first boat from Hamburg and sailed to America. He came first into New York and then immediately went to Chicago. He heard that there was more work ahead in Chicago for him. He had nothing with him except his soiled, infested clothing. He was able to learn a little English in the DP camp, but that was it. He did carry something with him. A lot of hatred and anger. He was so bitter, and he wanted revenge against the entire world. He met my mother at a B'nai B'rith Jewish dance on the west side of Chicago. They married in 1954. They had 3 children. I had 2 older brothers, and I'm the youngest. We grew up in West Rogers Park, a Jewish neighborhood of Chicago. My father didn't know how to process all these negative emotions. And he certainly wasn't going to see a therapist. He didn't believe in that. So he spewed all this negativity on the ones closest to him. So I grew up in an abusive home. And there was all sorts of abuse in my home, and each family member received different types of abuse. There was, of course, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse toward my mother. My father's Holocaust became my family's nightmare. I'm going to skip to the year 2008 now. I started to feel unsettled. I was divorced, raising 3 children, 3 beautiful, wonderful children. Something wasn't feeling right inside. Lots of turmoil. I wasn't calm. I didn't know. I wanted something more. I didn't feel right. So I decided it's time for me to see a therapist. And the therapist said to me, Karen, it's time that you learn to forgive your father. You see, you're carrying a lot of anger, a lot of bitterness, and you resent your father. And I looked at her and I thought that was the strangest thing. I should forgive my father? She says, yeah, it will help you. I said, but you don't understand. You see, I was raised in an Orthodox school. And what I learned about forgiveness is what I learned from my rabbis, who were my teachers. And this is what I learned. If somebody hurts me, they are obligated to ask me for forgiveness. In fact, they have 3 opportunities. If I choose not to forgive them the first time or the second time, but on the 3rd time, if I refuse, then the onus falls on me. And they must feel remorseful. when they ask. There's the Hebrew word called kavanah. You must ask with feeling and remorse. And I explained to my therapist, my father is never going to ask me for forgiveness. He's never going to admit that he did anything wrong. He probably thinks he didn't do anything wrong. And when he abused us, he said we deserved it. So why should I forgive my father? And she said, for yourself, Karen. For your children, Karen. So my first step of forgiveness began with an understanding of what the word forgiveness means. And it means feeling free. It means being happy, being at peace, not being a victim of my childhood. The next step of my forgiveness came the next year and a half. As I went through this emotional process, I spent a year and a half of getting angry, feeling sad, crying. I spent a lot of the time in the shower crying because it felt safe there. I didn't know that this was part of the process of forgiveness. You see, I was mourning the loss of a relationship that I never had with my father. As a little girl, all I wanted was for my dad to put his arms around me just once and say, Karen, I love you. Well, that never happened. And so I had to mourn this relationship that I'd never had with my dad. And after about a year and a half, when I had no more tears left, I knew that after purging all this negativity that I was carrying inside, I was on to the next step of forgiveness. I went to the nursing home to visit my dad, and I saw that morning he had edema. He was filled up with fluid throughout his body. And I said to the nurse, we need to call the emergency. We called. He was sent immediately to the ICU, and he laid in his bed for 7 days, comatose. Every day I would go to the hospital, put on the gown and the mask and the gloves. I made sure that the doctors and nurses were doing their job. But I sat by the edge of the room, by the door, minding my own business, reading on my phone. Something happened to me on that 7th day. Something that I've never felt for my father. I had this overwhelming feeling of compassion, and my heart swelled with compassion. I walked up to my father and I sat on his bed. The nurse was there, and I said, Nurse, do you think my father could hear me? And she said, absolutely not. He hasn't moved his fingers or toes. He hasn't opened his eyes, and it's been a week now, Karen. I'm sorry. She left the room. I took my father's hand and I held it, swollen. His arm was black and blue from being prodded with IV. I brushed the hair off of his face, and I noticed 2 vertical grooves. He looked like he was in pain. I held my father's hand and I said, Daddy, it's time to let go. You've suffered your entire life. You don't need to suffer in death. Let go. Your father, Chaim Shlomo, your mother, Bela, your sisters, your baby brother are all waiting for you. Daddy, let go. And I started to cry. I looked at my father and said, Daddy, I forgive you. I want you to know that I honestly forgive you. And I kept on weeping. I looked up briefly, and his eyes popped wide open. So I moved slightly to the right, and his eyes tracked me. And I moved to the left, and he followed me again. And I thought, is my father cheating death one more time? So I ran out of the room, beckoned for the nurse. I said, "Nurse, nurse, I think my father's waking up." We rushed back into the room, and his eyes were closed once again. My father passed away the next day. Now, I'll never know if my father heard me, if he understood what I was saying, but what I do know is that I buried my father with a loving and compassionate heart. I finally felt at peace. The sense of calm overcame me. Right after the funeral, my brother, who received the brunt of the physical abuse, said to me, "Karen, I wanted to take that pail and shovel and whip it at his coffin. I hate that man, and I hope he ends up in hell." I understand my brother. Life was difficult physically for him in our childhood. And we're all on our own journey of learning to forgive. So I thought, what if my father would have forgiven those that murdered his family? Would my childhood have been happier or healthier? So I thought, I'd like to go back to Rajgrod. Before I went back to Rajgrod, I thought I'd ask a few of my friends who are children of Holocaust survivors if they could ever forgive those that murdered their family. One girlfriend, who was a little girl in the Holocaust, yelled at me and said, "Karen, no, never. Are you crazy?" Another friend of mine said, "Karen, be very careful what you write about in your memoir. It sounds very Christian-like." Another friend said, "Karen, I haven't forgiven the Babylonians yet." So with that, I went with my boyfriend, who is now my husband, who happens to be a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and his father was in Auschwitz. We decided to go back to Poland. We traveled through the large cities, Warsaw, Krakow, Białystok. We went to the smaller villages. We went to Auschwitz. We finally made our way to Rajgrod. I went to my father's home facing that town square. I knocked on the door. No one was home. I went with my boyfriend, my husband, and an interpreter, and we walked to the side of the house. And there was a shack. Maybe that was the shack behind the house where my father was hiding. The door was open. There was an old woman inside. Eventually, she was able to come out, and we asked her, "Can I come into this house? This was my grandmother's home." And she said, "No, you may not come in." She looked very scared. 3 people coming to her house. I said, "Can I come in the backyard and say a prayer for my family?" And she said, "No, you may not. Stand where you are standing at the side of the home, and you can say a prayer there because your grandmother owned that lot of land." I wanted to say the Kaddish, a Jewish prayer of mourning, for all the Jews who died in Rajgrod during the Holocaust. And I wanted to recite it out loud. I wanted to recite this prayer for my family who perished in the Holocaust. A prayer that normally takes me 2 minutes to recite in Hebrew took me a half an hour because I was bawling like a child the entire time. What I didn't realize was, until I came back to Chicago, it was at that moment on my trip in Poland that I had purged all this legacy of suffering that I was carrying from generation to generation to generation. I had purged all this anger, all this bitterness, and I let it go in Rajgrod. I had forgiven those that murdered my grandmother, my aunts, my cousins. I've forgiven those that took my family from me, that ruined my father's life. So I finished writing my memoir, and then I had a thought, and I need to be very careful what I think about, because what I put out there sometimes usually comes back. As difficult as it was for me to forgive my father, I forgave him. He's passed. He can't hurt me anymore. As controversial as it might be to forgive those that murdered my family, that was over 70 years ago. No one's going to come knocking on my door trying to kill me or my children. But what if someone would dare hurt my children? That would be the ultimate challenge of forgiveness. A few months later, March 19th, 2013, it was 11 p.m. at night. I was in my home with 2 of the 3 of my children. They came in from spring break from the University of Illinois. I left my garage door open, and I lived in a suburb called Deerfield on the north side of Chicago. 3 masked men with guns entered my house. My son Noah was studying at the kitchen table for his MCATs. They threw him on the floor face down, bound his hands behind his back, bound his feet together, asked, "How many are upstairs?" And he said 2, gagged him, took his phone, and threw it in the microwave. He was held at gunpoint by one of the thugs. 2 of the home invaders ran upstairs. I woke up screaming, "Who are you? Who are you?" I thought this was a prank. One of the men was wearing medical scrubs and a surgeon's mask. He pulled down his mask and said, "Give me your hands." He tied up my hands and said, "Where's the cash?" I said, "I don't have any, but take me to the bank." You see, I wanted to leave. I didn't want them to hurt my children. He threw me down and held a gun at my head. The 3rd thug ran out of my room, down the hallway, and kicked my daughter's door open. Normally, when my children hear me screaming, they come running. They think there's probably a spider in my room. No one came to save me. What I didn't know was that my daughter had a premonition, a dream 6 months before this happened. In her dream, she's just turned the lights off in her room, put her phone right by her dresser, and started to fall asleep. But she heard the door open and close downstairs, and she grabbed her phone in her dream. She pressed 911 and waited. She heard someone walking up the stairs. She said, "Could that be my oldest brother Max coming home? But why would he be? He doesn't live here anymore." So she waited, and in her dream, she then heard her brother Max say, "I'm home, everybody." So she put her phone down and went to bed. But this time, she turned the lights off. She put her phone down. She heard the door open and close. She grabs her phone, instinctively dials 911 and waits. She hears someone running up the stairs. She hears me screaming. She presses send, runs to the door, locks her door, hides behind her dresser. Within seconds, that third gunman burst her door open, and now she had a gun to her head. He said, "Give me the phone." She said, "Take my wallet, take my computer." He grabbed the phone and saw that she had dialed for emergency. He ran out of her room, grabbed the guy holding me. They both ran down. All three men then bolted out of my home and disappeared. And it was too late. Within minutes, the Deerfield police had surrounded my house. It was too late. They were all gone. I can honestly say that this was the first time I understood how my father felt. Paralyzed with fear, traumatized. My kids were traumatized. Thankfully, we weren't physically hurt. Though my experience was only 5 minutes compared to what my father endured for 3.5 years living in the forest, I was so scared. I was filled with so much anger, and I wanted those men caught, and I wanted justice. How dare anyone come into my house and try to harm my children? I realized something from my experience. Justice is not going to bring me peace. You see, I wanted to go back to that place of calm, the place of joy and being happy before this happened. I was a wreck 24/7 on the computer looking up home invaders. My father, after his home invasion in the Holocaust and after he came here, spent his entire life trying to figure out how to get even with those men that he knew that murdered his family. He spent his entire life wanting revenge. Am I going to spend my entire life seeking justice? Is it going to make me happy? I know, I realize that I needed to forgive those men. And so I did. I've learned to forgive my father. I've learned to forgive those men who killed my family in Rajgrod. And I've learned to forgive those thugs who almost took my dear precious children and ruined their lives. I'd like to end with a quote. "By not forgiving is like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die." So thank you. I'd be happy to take questions from you, but first I have a question for all of you. How many of you, just raise your hand, when you were children, had a heart-to-heart conversation with your parents or guardians or relatives about the topic of forgiveness? Raise your hand. Nobody? What about today? How many of you today have talked about forgiveness with your children, grandchildren, friends? Today, a few more hands have gone up, but not too many. My purpose here is, by sharing my story, I hope we can bring the topic of forgiveness into more conversation with your family and friends. So, with that, I will take some questions. He didn't discuss that aspect, but you're right, as a young man, just like my son Noah, he wanted to be there to save his mother and sister, My father wanted to be there to save his mother and sisters, and he couldn't because he knew he would die. And that is definitely an aspect of probably the pain and that he carried as well. Many Holocaust survivors also, some of them believe, they wonder, why was I saved instead of my mother or my cousin or my father? And a lot of times they may carry guilt. I don't know what my father would have experienced.
He never talked about it.
Not so much about emotions, more so about the actual occurrence of events. And that was mostly with my oldest brother, may God rest his soul, Howard, who passed away when he was 35. So this woman here said her father was also from Poland, a survivor, and was also abusive at times, and it was difficult.
I have 3 sisters. I saw it in the house too.
Yes, with 3 sisters.
He was very short-tempered.
Short-tempered. Part of, some people often ask me, well, what was my father's personality before the war? And because maybe this was part of his personality. And I have 2 comments about that. Number one, it makes no difference what his personality was before the war. I need to forgive him. I need to let this go for myself. I need to let this go for my children. I want to be a role model to them. The other part of this is there are many soldiers today who've gone to Afghanistan or right after 9/11 have gone to war. They come back and 22 soldiers a day are committing suicide. There are also soldiers today, they have PTSD. Some soldiers will take it out on themselves, and some soldiers will take it out on their family. I believe my father had the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And you never know when you're going to become enraged and full of rage and become explosive. It's part of the PTSD. In my memoir, I also talk about how children of survivors, how we are biologically different than other children whose parents or grandparents have not gone through war or famine or major life stress. We are different. Thank you for sharing. Hatred begets hatred. The only way to conquer hatred is, I believe, through love, through peace, through compassion. I was asked to come and speak in Germany this August. A physician, a psychiatrist, had read my memoir. There is a conference in Munster called Refugees, Trauma, and Reconciliation, and they have asked me to come. Now, Elie Wiesel, I'm sure, God bless his soul, he passed away a few weeks ago. He had said the quote of, "You don't blame the children of the Germans. They are not to blame. It's their parents." So everyone has their own process of forgiveness. Mine first started with understanding what the word means. It means not being a victim of my past. How do I achieve that? Well, I want to be happy. I want to be filled with joy. Shalom. Shalom means to be whole and complete. In order for me to be whole and complete and be happy, I have to let go of my abusive childhood. And in order for me to do that, I understood mentally that I had to forgive my father. But that was the first part. The second part was emotionally purging all these negative feelings that I carried. It was poison inside of me. I hated my father. I didn't want anything to do with him. I had to purge that, cry and get angry and feel sad because I stuffed my emotions down and said, I'm okay. I'm doing great. I have a nice job. I've raised 3 children, but I was feeling unsettled. That took me a year and a half. The next step for me came compassion toward my father. When my heart was filled with this love toward him, I was then able to utter the words, I forgive you. Fortunately, it was on his deathbed and before he passed. That was my process. And it took a couple of years till I finally was able to go through that after a lifetime of living as a victim of my childhood. It may be different with others, I don't know. But I know that this has helped me, and not only me, it's also helped my children. You see, I don't want my children to grow up and if somebody has hurt them, traumatized them, that they're going to hang on to this hatred or sadness for the rest of their lives. You see, I believe that God wants me to be happy and to be at peace. I believe that I deserve to be filled with shalom, with peace and calm. Hanging on to this anger isn't going to help me, isn't going to heal me. It doesn't benefit me, and it doesn't benefit my children. So I knew for me that the only way that I could heal is to forgive. And that's how I came upon this process. Exactly. Why be miserable my whole life? Many of you may have been hurt by your family, maybe your parents, maybe you didn't feel loved, maybe your parents were abusive, maybe they abandoned or rejected or betrayed you, maybe this was with people you've worked with. I can't hang on to that anymore. What I've realized was what my rabbis were telling me, what I learned about forgiveness, was more really about reconciliation. And I'm not talking about reconciliation. Reconciliation brings 2 parties together to talk. Forgiveness is allowing myself, without the other party, to forgive. I don't need the other party there. I need to let this go myself. Yes, it would be wonderful if the other party was able to voice it, but if they're not alive anymore, they can't. If they're not willing to, there is no reconciliation or forgiveness. I needed to do it for myself and for my children. Absolutely. His question was it cathartic to write the memoir? It absolutely was. There are so many stories that I can't even cover today. But as I write the stories, things just kept coming back from my childhood. And I kept on crying, and it was so cathartic. It was healing to write this. And I encourage that if any of you... When I was in high school, my favorite subject was math. The thought of writing a paper, I was horrified. In fact, my older brother helped me write. I wasn't planning to write a book, but it was healing. And I encourage anyone, you don't have to be a writer just to write your experience of your childhood. It helps. It really does. It helped me. Thank you.
Has your brother come around to forgiveness?
Slowly, yes. Like I said, he received the brunt of the physical abuse. My father hated him, had no respect or love for him.
Was he able to say Kaddish for your father?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. Now, my oldest brother, Howard, was a rabbi here in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, but he had died in his bed. We don't know why at age 35. He had 2 little kids. And I came in this weekend also because his son, my nephew, just got married. And it was wonderful and it was emotional all at the same time, wishing that my brother would have been alive. For my father, for my mother, especially my father, when my brother died, I was so angry at God. How dare God hurt my family again? Didn't we go through enough? Didn't my father go through enough during the Holocaust that he has to come here and bury his firstborn son? My father was able to trace his ancestry back to the time when we were expelled from Spain. We come from a lineage of rabbis. And my brother became a rabbi. And now my father has to bury his firstborn son, a rabbi. I was angry. Question, why did my father... my brother had dyslexia. And when you read words, and the teachers in school said he was lazy and stupid. And for my father he came here, he worked hard, he was constantly working, and for someone to say that your own child is lazy, well, my father did not like that at all, and there's an aversion to my brother. My mother, thank God, she was not a survivor. What she had within her was a lot of love. She showed me unconditional love. So my father taught me hate, and my mother taught me love. I could have easily gone and chosen the life of my father, continuing to hate and carry this hatred in my heart. Luckily, I was working with a therapist and learning to let that go. And luckily, my mother, she was 19 when she married my father. He told her he was 28, but he was really 32. And she was a battered wife till she died when she was 62 years old. But through it all, she always tried to protect us in the house. Thank you for asking.
What did your father do for a living?
My father was a social worker, which annoyed him. He came here, he went to, in Chicago, Roosevelt University, which is one of the few universities in the Chicago area that would allow Jews to study. Became a social worker, and he really resented giving welfare to poor people in Chicago. Nobody gave him money. Nobody gave him more money for having more children. And it seemed like many of my father's experiences in life kept on hardening his heart. Experience after experience. And when my brother died, it was too much for him to bear, and you can sense the changes in him even further.
How old was your dad?
My dad, when he passed, he was 89 years old. So she grew up in an abusive home. Your mother, you said, was abusive, but she was able to share with her mother in her last minute before she passed, and that helped you move on tremendously. And it's so, you don't understand. It's hard. Maybe you do understand, but I didn't get it until I was able to forgive. Once I did, I just felt so much lighter, filled with joy. I can't explain it, but you feel so calm and good. And I want to keep this feeling with me.
All I do is tell jokes.
Okay. She tells jokes now, and which is good. Makes other people feel good. Yes, yes. We all deserve to be happy and full of joy. And just as I deserve, I want my community to feel at peace and feel at joy. That's why I took it upon myself to forgive those that killed my family. I didn't want to pass the suffrage, this legacy of suffrage on. I want to feel like I am a people, that I come from Sinai, a people who brought the world, the law, and to love, and to command to love God and love people and to honor people. I don't want to carry this lineage of coming from out of Auschwitz. Am I a person out of Auschwitz, or am I a person from Sinai? And I will never forget. And now the world has one more story of the Holocaust. And my son, Max, who is a history high school teacher who teaches AP US history, makes sure that he spends a good week talking about the Holocaust to his students every year. So thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.